things that I really like about critical discourse analysis, as opposed to what is usually happening in linguistics. Linguistics tends to be method-oriented, so the groups that form around method, not about an object of study or even an aim of study. Critical discourse analysis is not, and should, in my opinion, not be unified on the level of method. We are quite eclectic about method. Method is, we are oriented towards a particular aim, towards a critical aim. We use methods as they are useful.
My view of methods is that you find a research topic, as I was saying earlier, you apply a certain set of theoretical resources to that research topic to produce coherent objects of research. And it's in the light of the objects of research that you select appropriate methods. And I think that that is taking the view that's there in the board here, basically. So I would not want to talk about the methods of critical discourse analysis. If we mean by that how it collects data, how it analyzes data. So it's appropriate for CDA or workers with CDA in certain circumstances to do what some people have begun to do. We were talking about more informally before. That is to actually move into forms of ethnographic work and in a sense bring the resources of critical discourse analysis into ethnographic work. If you're addressing research questions that are to do with, for instance, in the work I'm doing on transition, how are these new discourses that are being recontextualized in transitional countries actually being operationalized in social life? And that's a dialectic from discourses to ways of acting and to genres, to ways of being and to styles, as well as to more material aspects of life.
I think you have to be very systematic in whatever you are doing. But that doesn't mean that you have just one way of doing whatever you are doing. So if you are interested in the linguistic representation of the world, then you need to know about the functioning of language, how language is structured, and you start there. And then from there, and I think Norman's theoretical framework is very, very helpful, because you start there as a linguist, and then you go up the ladder till you get to social practice, and in a very systematic way. So I'm absolutely in favor of being systematic in whatever you do. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be positivist about your interpretation. But I think that different methods require different ways of doing things. So it depends on what you are interested in.
Another distinctive thing I think about my framework is the centrality that's been put on. One could say that if you're doing critical discourse analysis, everyone has this problem of mediation. How do you move from this social analysis to textual analysis? And I think my approach to that has been centered on the idea of, the concepts of order of discourse and interdiscursivity. Order of discourse in the sense of particular articulations of discourses, genres and styles that are relatively stabilized around networks of social practices such as the field of media and politics, and interdiscursivity as a way of looking at a more concrete level at the way in which particular texts draw upon and potentially re-articulate these more stable combinations of discourses, genres and styles. So that's been for me the mediating element on the assumption that in talking about discourses, genres and styles, you're talking about entities that are already half linguistic and half social. So it's a way of moving between social analysis, political economic analysis, and linguistic analysis, sort of semiotic analysis of text interactions.
Many people also who send papers to the journals say they're going to use the method of critical discourse analysis, and then I wonder, what are they talking about? Because first of all, there are many people doing critical discourse analysis in many people of the world, and one person does more ethnographic work, and other people do interviewing, and other people do systematic grammatical analysis of sentence structures, and other people do interviewing, and so on and so on, and everybody does it in different ways. So it has nothing to do with methods. Critical discourse analysis can be done with any kind of method, with any kind of theory. What we are interested in is in problems, in objectives, in a critical perspective on society and so on. So it's more a perspective or an attitude or a movement and so on, but it has nothing to do with method, because there are as many different methods in critical discourse analysis as you have in discourse analysis.
Analytically, I am now very interested in how meanings are embodied, and what the difference is between getting meanings through the eye as against getting meaning through the ear, or getting meaning through the touch of fingers, or through the taste on your tongue and in your mouth, or the smelling in your nose. And all of these are, for me, equally important routes to meaning. So meaning made in the mouth being as important as meaning made in the ear or through the ear. But what we do practically, and you may have seen some of this, is we say, well, let's identify the modes that can be identified, always accepting the provisionality of the notion of mode. To take the visual, say to take image as a mode, is also a fiction. It's as much a fiction as to take, let's say, speech as a mode, or writing as a mode. I mean, I don't any longer now think of language as a mode, because the material constitution of writing and of speech are so different. But for me, therefore, image is as much a fiction in the sense, does one regard as colour? Does one regard colour as being part of image, or is it a separate mode? And you can kind of regard colour as a separate mode. So in a sense, the decision of the analyst that decides to a large extent what should be mode, or the practices of the community of practice decide what should be mode. A photographer, for instance, would be horrified by seeing a photograph lumped together with a painting, or a drawing, or an etching, or something else. But to go back to your question, what we do is we attempt to identify, so for instance in our work in a science classroom, we attempt to identify those things which seem, through the teacher's practice and the student's responses and practices, to be modes which can be identified as being somehow autonomous enough to be seen as means for making signs in that mode. And we identify them, and then we say, what are the signs made in this mode? And then we have attempted to develop a form of transcription in which you show the co-occurrence of modes all at the same time. I mean, you can no longer, for instance, assume that in many transcriptions what you have is a linguistic transcript of what goes on in the classroom, with little things interspersed either in brackets or on other lines, sort of showing other things going on. Well, that's impossible. I mean, in any case, it privileges the linguistic as being, the core of what goes on, and it's in a multimodal approach that's impossible to do. The linguistic might be central, or it might be entirely peripheral.
I want you to see that people are designers, they're implementers, they're actively using their grammar to produce. It's not something they just took, and it's not just a code. And I asked, myself how to do that, and I thought, well, okay, I'll just use the word building. But there are obvious things. There's things like, anytime you're communicating, you're trying to build social relationships, right? So let's look what aspects of this language are building relationships. You're building ways of privileging certain forms of knowledge, right? What counts as knowledge and what doesn't count as knowledge. I mean, in this interview, I have obviously spent a lot of time trying to privilege a type of knowledge that is applied and intervenes and thinks that it's important to have a point rather than purely descriptive knowledge. You could go in and say, well, how did he do that? So there's those 7 building tasks. There could be 11. I mean, but the basic, what they're really meant for is for people who want to begin to do this, begin to practice this. They are one way to ask questions. Okay, let me look. Is there any really interesting stuff going on how people are building relationships, or how they are privileging certain forms of knowledge, or what identities they're building, and they're just a way in there. And any text you analyze, it won't always be that all of the building tasks are fruitful in that text. You might find the one text is really interesting what they're doing in just one of them. And then you would run that. But so it's a way to get started in a way. But more important to me, I really wanted people to everyday people think of grammar as something that's just stored passively in my head, and I'm just following the rules. They don't see themselves as actually partly making up the rules as they go. You're using it almost like a kit, like a set of colors that you can paint with. The grammar is just that. It's just a palette of colors, and then you paint your own painting with it. And what you're painting is a building, it is a design, and you're seeing yourself as a designer. Tools of inquiry are my theoretical devices that capture my theory of language. Right, that was my way of stating simultaneously a tool of analysis and a theory of language. And if you look at that book and you look at the tools of inquiry, they flow from my ideas about what language are. So, I think that a primary thing we're doing in language is communicating a social identity and communicating a social activity, and that's why social languages are defined that way. I also think a primary thing we're doing in language is we're not just inheriting it, we're inventing it, and that's why situated meanings are in there. I also think that language is never divorced from non-language practices. And that we integrate and make meaning with everything we do. That's why big D discourse. So it's my theory of language, then written as tools. The relationship to the building tasks is, of course, first the building tasks reflect this designer attitude towards language. But the tools of inquiry and the building tools are meant to be questions. They're tools at this level. You're trying to do a discourse analysis. You want to know whether my method works. Ask a question for each building task, ask a question for each tool, see if you got some useful stuff. If you did, use it. If you don't, go